How's it going, my festive bakers? Welcome to episode number 3 of the Christmas series. Today I have a very unique bread for you, full of dried fruits, alcohol and rye flour. So let's go to the kitchen and check it out. I was not planning on making a rye bread for the Christmas series this year, but whilst flicking through the Rye Baker by Stanley Ginsberg, I came across this recipe. To call it a bread is a bit of a stretch, I must admit, because the bulk of this loaf is made up of dried fruits and nuts. But it does look like a little loaf of bread, and it contains rye flour. This must be the richest Christmas bake so far. The bread though is basically only there to keep the fruits and nuts together. It has a nice chewy texture, and the flavors of all the spices, citrus, honey and alcohol mingle together to create a perfect Christmas treat. So let me show you how it's made, starting with the ingredients for the rum soaker. We'll need some chopped dried figs, raisins, cranberries, toasted hazelnuts, pine nuts, honey and some dark rum. You can of course adjust this recipe. Use different fruits, different nuts, and if you don't want alcohol, just swap it for some orange juice perhaps. There's a lot of room for adjustments here. This recipe is so rich that there are 2 alcoholic soakers in it. The second one consists of candied citrus peel and sweet white wine. Let's look at the ingredients for the bread dough next. We'll need some whole grain or dark rye flour, white bread flour, water, yeast, salt, olive oil, orange zest, lemon zest. When it comes to the spices, we have ground nutmeg, ground anise seed, cinnamon, ground fennel and ground cloves. And again, you can adjust these to your taste, or just leave 1 or 2 out. Before the loaf goes in the oven, we'll brush it with a honey and warm water mix. And to decorate, I decided to use some blanched almonds and some glacé cherries. This one again is up to you. You could decorate it in 100 different ways with different ingredients. When it comes to the equipment, we don't need much. A tray with some nonstick paper, bowl, scales, a dough scraper, temperature probe, a brush, and a fine grater for the lemon and orange zests. With all that out of the way, let's begin the process. And it all starts with the soakers. Combine hazelnuts, pine nuts, raisins, cranberries, and dried figs. Give it all a good mix to ensure that everything's dispersed evenly. Then, in a separate bowl, combine the honey and the rum. Mix them together, and only then pour the honey and rum mixture over the dried fruits and nuts. Doing it this way ensures that everything's evenly mixed. As I mentioned previously, if you don't want to use alcohol, use some orange juice, or you could use some different alcohol. But I think dark rum works best, because it already contains those spicy Christmas flavors. A quick note on the amount of ingredients here. I am using quite a lot of dried fruits and nuts, and that makes this recipe quite expensive, but I will get 2 loaves out of this. So you can easily halve the ingredients and make only 1 loaf at half the price. Okay, once you have mixed your rum soaker, cover it up and leave it on the side. Let's move on to the wine soaker. And it's made exactly the same way. Just combine the dry ingredient with the liquid, and that is all the prep we need to do a day ahead of time. The rum and wine soakers need to be left to sit overnight. That will ensure that most of the liquid gets absorbed by the dry ingredients. There is no need to refrigerate these, just leave them out at room temperature. Around 10 to 12 hours soaking should be sufficient. I made these in the evening and continued on the next day. It is a good idea to mix the soakers at least once during the soaking process. Some of the liquid would have settled at the bottom of the bowl, because the dried ingredients that are submerged in it cannot absorb anymore. Mixing them around at least once will ensure maximum absorption. Okay, it's the next day now. Let's continue by making the dough. Unlike most other recipes, I want this dough to rise quickly. The taste of the dough in this recipe is drowned out by all the other flavors, so there's no need to slow ferment it. I'm using very warm water this time, at almost 29 degrees Celsius or 84 degrees Fahrenheit, and the proportion of yeast in this dough is a lot higher than usual. This will not only make it rise quickly, but it will also give the dough the power to lift up all the heavy ingredients. To make the dough, in a large bowl, combine the water, the yeast, the salt, all the spices, your fennel, clove, cinnamon, nutmeg, anise seed, add the oil, the orange zest, the lemon zest, and then give it all a good mix. You want to ensure that the salt is completely dissolved. Mix until you can't feel it scraping against the bottom of the bowl anymore. Finally, add the white bread flour and whole grain rye flour and mix it to a dough. After mixing, check the temperature for reference. If your dough turns out warmer, it will ferment more rapidly. If it's cooler, it'll take longer. My kitchen is quite cool, and the dough is not very hot either. But even so, the bulk fermentation will take no more than 1 hour. During this time, you can start preheating the oven to 160 degrees Celsius, 320 Fahrenheit, fan on. If your oven doesn't have a fan, go for 180 Celsius, 355 Fahrenheit. Once the dough has doubled in size, we can move on. But before we mix the final dough, let's make the glaze. Combine the warm water and the honey and mix them together. There's really not much else to it. Now let's move on to mixing the final dough. First, add the wine soaker, mix it in, then add the rum soaker and mix that in too. The dough will be extremely sticky and wet. You might just think that it's too wet and too loose, but don't panic. That's exactly how it should feel like. Do not start adding any extra flour to this mix. After mixing, you want to wet your hand with water, then split the dough in half and shape each half into an oblong loaf or a round loaf, it's up to you. Then place it on a non-stick paper lined baking tray, brush it with a honey water glaze, and finally decorate it. And while I'm getting on with that, let me tell you something about this bread. Traditionally, this is baked a couple of weeks ahead of Christmas and then left to mature. After baking, it's left to cool down, then wrapped up and then left to sit at room temperature for the flavors to mingle. You do not have to do this, but you can if you want to. I cut one loaf and tried it as soon as it cooled down, and I wrapped up the other one and left it to sit for over 1 week. You'll see that at the end of the video. This type of aging or maturing method is quite common, especially with rich fruitcakes containing alcohol. German Stollen is often aged, and traditional British Christmas pudding too. Okay, back to our little loaves here. After shaping, I wet my hands with water again and smoothed out the surface of the loaves. Next comes the honey water glaze. Mine was a little bit too liquid, so I've adjusted the recipe so yours is thicker. I used equal parts of honey and water. As for the decorations, just make sure that you press them into the dough properly. You can use seeds, nuts, dried fruits, or you can leave the loaves plain, it's up to you. Right, these bad boys are ready for the oven, and they will take some time to bake because they are quite dense. Around 60 to 70 minutes at this temperature should do it. Of course, it's pretty hard to tell the doneness of this kind of bread just by looking at it, so your temperature probe will come in really handy here again. Once the crust looks nice and brown and the timer's run out, pull the loaves out of the oven and take their temperature. If it reads above 94 degrees Celsius or 200 degrees Fahrenheit, it's ready. Now let's leave these bad boys to cool down on a rack. Once they're cooled down, we'll wrap up one of them, leave it to mature, and we'll taste the other one whilst it's still fresh. When it comes to wrapping up and storing, you can use cling film or aluminium foil. I've got this compostable cling film that I've been using lately. It works well. You might have noticed that this loaf is nice and shiny. Coming out of the oven, these little breads are a little bit dull looking, so I gave them both a light brushing of oil to give them that really nice shine. But there you have it. That's how you make a South Tyrolean Christmas bread or cake. Call it what you want. It is rich, aromatic, sweet, chewy. All the dried fruits, nuts, spices, alcohol and citrus work together to create that classic Christmas taste. This is definitely an old school bake, but old is gold, I say. And here's our aged loaf, around 9 days later. I could not wait any longer, I just had to crack it open. Texture wise, it was still nice and soft and chewy, but taste wise, I think I actually preferred the freshly baked loaf. It was more fruity and citrusy. Leaving it to sit for a while seemed to have brought out more of the hazelnut and pine nut flavors. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, it's just personal preference. If you're going to make the full recipe, try it out for yourself. Or maybe make one loaf, wrap it up, keep it for a couple of weeks, and then make another one and compare them side by side. So what do you think of this recipe? Have you ever seen it before? Have you ever tried it before? Let me know down in the comments. You want to see more videos like this one? Click over here. Subscribe to the channel, click right here. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.